In February 1778, a heavy carriage pulled up to the gates of Paris. The customs officers performed their routine inspection, searching for smuggled goods or forbidden literature that might threaten the stability of the crown. When they leaned in to ask the frail 83-year-old passenger if he was carrying any contraband, the old man offered a faint, sardonic smile. "Gentlemen," he whispered, "I believe there's no contraband here, except for me."
It wasn't just a clever line. It was a summary of a lifetime spent as the most dangerous, illegal asset in Europe. But what makes this scene truly fascinating isn't just the old man's wit. It's where he came from. He wasn't a desperate revolutionary with nothing to lose. He was born into the heart of the establishment. His father was a wealthy royal official, a pragmatic man who had spent years hammering a single lesson into his son's head. If you want to thrive, you must adapt to the system. Don't fight it. Just take your piece of the cake and live a life others envy. For a long time, the son followed that path. He was a brilliant socialite, an insider who lived in mansions and moved in circles where the elite divided the spoils of the kingdom.
He had the money, the fame, and the protection of high-ranking friends. By all accounts, he should have been the ultimate loyal citizen. Yet, there was a strange, persistent glitch in his character. Every time he was offered a comfortable seat at the table of power, he chose to flip the table instead. He was thrown into the Bastille twice, exiled across borders, and saw his writings publicly burned by the state. Even when he was being pampered by foreign kings or living in luxury with a brilliant marquise, he couldn't stop himself from hurting the feelings of the authorities. That instantaneous shift from a man who had everything to a man who risked everything just to say the wrong thing is what leaves us stunned. Why would someone so deeply embedded in the privileged class become the most relentless critic of the very system that fed him? Was he just a problem child who never grew up, or was he seeing a reality that his father's pragmatic logic was too blind to catch? To understand the story of the man who called himself Contraband, we have to look at the life of history's strongest rebel, Voltaire. Okay, so that opening really sets the scene, doesn't it?
It's an incredible image. The most dangerous man in Europe is this frail, old guy in a carriage.
Right. And we all know the name Voltaire. It's one of those names that, it just floats around in history class. It's usually attached to a picture of a guy in a powdered wig looking, slightly amused, maybe a bit smug.
Or it's a witty quote on a coffee mug about free speech that, as we'll get into, he may or may not have actually said in those exact words.
But usually he's just reduced to the Enlightenment guy. He's a statue. He's a concept. But when you actually dig into the files we have today, and we have a lot, the biographies, the thousands of letters he wrote, these philosophical treatises, you realize he was so much more complicated.
Oh, so much.
And honestly, a lot more chaotic than the history books let on. He wasn't just a writer. He was this walking contradiction, a rich man who fought for the poor, an insider who became the ultimate outsider.
And that's really the mission for this deep dive, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
We're not just looking at Voltaire, the writer. We are looking at Voltaire as the archetype of what we might call the intellectual exile.
The intellectual exile.
And we have a massive stack of sources here to do it. We have biographical transcripts detailing his life. From the Bastille all the way to the Swiss border. We have his own letters comparing nations and some pretty heavy modern analysis on the concept of exile and revolution, including some great work by Edward Said.
And it all seems to circle this really tense question that just kept popping up in the reading. How do you criticize a corrupt system, a system that you are, let's be honest, arguably a part of without burning the whole world down? Because that seems to be the tightrope he walked his entire life.
It is the central tension of his life and, frankly, of the entire 18th century. Voltaire is so fascinating because he is the glitch in the matrix. He is the error code in the French software.
I love that image, the glitch in the system. So let's go back to the beginning, to the source code, so to speak. The source material makes a huge point that he wasn't born Voltaire. That name was an invention.
Oh, he was François-Marie Arouet. And that background is absolutely crucial to understanding him. He wasn't peasant starving in the streets of Paris. He was the son of a wealthy royal official, a notary and a minor treasury official.
So not just comfortable, he was well connected.
Deeply connected. You have to picture the dinner table conversations. His father, old Monsieur Arouet, isn't just some boring dad. He's a notary to the king. In 18th century France, that means he holds the keys to the safe. He knows where the bodies are buried, financially speaking. He's the guy who draws up the contracts for the aristocracy.
So he's a man of the establishment.
He is the definition of it. And he is telling his son, Francois, look, I have mapped out your entire life. It's simple. You become a lawyer, you buy a title, because you could just buy noble titles back then, and you die rich, respected, and safe.
And honestly, That's a pretty compelling pitch. Why wouldn't you take that deal? It's arguably the smart play. If someone offered me a guaranteed path to wealth and security in a world that was, let's face it, pretty volatile, I'd probably sign on the dotted line.
That's exactly it. The system worked for people like them. This wasn't a story of a peasant fighting for a crust of bread. This was a story of a guy who had a VIP pass to the club and, for some reason, decided to light the club on fire.
So it's not just, teenage rebellion against his dad. It's almost pathological.
It's visceral. It's something deep in his psychology.
Yeah.
We have letters where his father essentially threatens to ship him off to the colonies, basically threatening to exile him to the West Indies if he keeps writing poetry instead of studying law.
And what does he do?
He doesn't just write poetry. He writes satire about the sexual habits of the regent's daughter. He isn't poking the bear, he's slapping the bear in the face with a salmon.
Okay, that's a very specific kind of death wish. But why? What's driving that? Is it ego? Is it just that he liked the attention?
That's certainly part of it. The man had a massive ego, no question.
Yeah.
But it's also that glitch we talked about. He physically couldn't stand hypocrisy. When he saw a nobleman acting like a fool or a priest living in luxury while preaching poverty, the insider part of his brain, the part that sounded like his father, said, shut up, take the money, play the game. But the writer part of his brain said, destroy him.
And that part always seemed to win.
Always.
And this brings us to the catalyst. We have to look at the political context for a second. King Louis XIV, the Sun King, had just died. He had ruled for so long that he basically was the state itself. When he died, there was a huge power vacuum.
A massive one. The regent, the Duke of Orleans, took over because the new king, Louis XV, was just a child.
And the regent was, let's just say, a colorful character.
That is an incredibly polite way of putting it. The regent was known for, well, debauchery, massive financial scandals. The Mississippi bubble happened under his watch, which was a huge economic crash, and a general loosening of morals. The court, which had been so rigid under Louis XIV, became a playground.
And young Arouet, the aspiring poet, couldn't help himself.
He couldn't resist. He wrote these incredibly sharp satirical poems suggesting that under this leadership, France was going to perish. He accused the regent of incest, of corruption, of everything under the sun.
And you don't just tweet that out in 1717 and get away with a slap on the wrist.
No, you get the Iron Mask treatment. He was arrested and thrown into the Bastille for 11 months.
Okay, let's just pause on that. You're in your early 20s. You are from a good, wealthy family. You're used to velvet and fine wine and witty conversation in salons, and suddenly you are rotting in a cold, damp stone dungeon because you wrote a poem. That has to change a person. It's not just a timeout. It's a profound psychological break.
The sources suggest it was the moment the insider died. The system he was supposed to join had just tried to crush him. So when he came out, he did something incredibly symbolic. He changed his name. He abandoned the name Arouet, his father's name, the name of the obedient civil servant, and adopted the name Voltaire.
So it wasn't just a pen name, like Mark Twain or George Orwell. It was a full-on rebranding.
It was a shedding of identity. It was a declaration of independence. He was essentially saying, I am not my father's son. I am not a product of this system. I am a self-made creation. He walked into that prison as a boy named Arouet and walked out as a legend named Voltaire.
But even with a new name, he couldn't stay out of trouble. It was like he was drawn to it. The sources detailed this specific incident with the Chevalier that really seems to be the turning point toward actual literal exile.
Yes, the Chevalier de Rohan Chabot. This is a crucial event. It really reads like a scene from a movie, the moment the protagonist realizes the villains are truly in charge and the rules don't apply to them.
So what happened?
Voltaire was at the opera or a similar high society gathering, and he's at the height of his fame as a playwright. This nobleman, the Chevalier, who came from a very old but not particularly distinguished family, decided to mock him in public. He said something along the lines of, Monsieur de Voltaire, what is that name? Do you have no ancestors?
Basically calling him a nobody.
Exactly, a social climber. And Voltaire, being Voltaire, replied with one of the most devastating burns in literary history. He said, I am the first of my name. You are the last of yours.
Ouch. That is a direct hit.
It was a devastating insult to a nobleman whose only value, whose only currency was his lineage. But the consequence was brutal. And this is the important part. The Chevalier didn't challenge him to a duel of swords. That would have implied they were equals.
Right.
Instead, a few days later, the Chevalier had his servants ambush Voltaire in the street and beat him with sticks, while the Chevalier watched comfortably from his carriage.
That is unbelievably humiliating.
It was designed to be. It was a message. Know your place, little poet. And when Voltaire, battered and bruised, tried to get justice, he tried to sue, he tried to challenge the Chevalier to a real duel. His high society friends, the people he thought were his peers, the dukes and marquises he dined with, all turned their backs on him.
They closed ranks.
They basically told him, look, you don't sue a Chevalier, you're just a writer, he's blood. The system protects its own.
That must have been the moment he realized the entire game was rigged. No matter how much money he made, no matter how famous he got, he was still contraband to them. He was not part of the club.
Exactly. The government sided with the noble. To avoid another stint in the Bastille, or frankly something worse, Voltaire was given a choice. Prison or exile. He chose exile. He was sent to England.
And this is where we get into the heavy lifting of our source material regarding the concept of exile, right? We have the writings of Edward Said here, his famous essay, Reflections on Exile. And he talks about exile not just as being kicked out of a country, but as a subjective position, a state of mind.
Yes. And it's really worth digging into this Edward Said essay for a minute, because it gives us a perfect framework to understand what happens inside Voltaire's brain. Said talks about the contrapuntal nature of exile.
Contrapuntal, like in music, counterpoint.
Yeah.
Two melodies playing at once.
Exactly. If you live in the town you were born in and you never leave, you hear one melody. You hear the melody of your culture, your laws, your habits, your religion. And because it's the only melody that's ever playing, you think it's music. You think it's just how the world is supposed to sound. It's natural.
It's the water the fish swims in. You don't question why you bow to a king or why the church has all this power, because that's just how it is.
Right. But the exile hears two melodies at the same time. He hears the melody of his new home, in this case England, and at the very same time, he hears the memory of the melody of his old home, France. And because he hears both simultaneously, he has this profound realization that neither of them is the truth. They're just songs. They're composed by people, and if they are composed, they can be rewritten.
That's an intellectual superpower. But Cicet also says it's a miserable existence.
It's incredibly lonely, because you never fully belong anywhere again. You're always the other. Your accent is wrong, your references are off, you're permanently out of sync. But Voltaire took that loneliness and he weaponized it. He essentially realized, since I don't belong to the French court and I don't belong to the English Parliament, my only loyalty is to reason itself.
So being kicked out of France was actually the very thing that allowed Voltaire to truly see France for the first time.
It gave him that critical distance, that second melody. And when he landed in England in 1726, it was like landing on another planet. Which leads us perfectly into our second section, the English garden versus the French fire.
I love this contrast. So he arrives in England. He's in his early 30s. He doesn't speak the language well at first. He's been beaten, humiliated, and kicked out of his home. He's pretty isolated. But then he starts looking around, and he writes this famous collection of essays, Letters on the English, or Lettres philosophiques.
Which were, by the way, immediately banned and publicly burned in France the second they were published there.
Of course they were. So what did he find in England that was so revolutionary, so dangerous to the French authorities?
He found a society that seemed to function on a completely different operating software than France. In the letters, he breaks it down into a few key areas that were just mind-blowing to a Frenchman: religion, commerce, and government.
Okay, let's start with religion. France was, for all intents and purposes, strictly Catholic. If you were a Protestant, a Huguenot, you were at best a second-class citizen, at worst actively persecuted.
Right. There was one official faith, one truth. Dissent was not tolerated. But in England, he found what he saw as a chaotic but functional mess of different religious sects. He was particularly fascinated by the Quakers.
Why them specifically?
Because they were the opposite of everything the French Catholic Church stood for.
Yeah.
Here was a religious group with no priests, no baptism, no fancy rituals, who refused to swear oaths or even lift their hats to authority figures. By French standards, they should be burned as heretics or arrested as anarchists.
But they weren't.
Not only were they not, Voltaire described them as peaceful, honest, and hardworking. He saw that the very multiplicity of sects in England, the Presbyterians, the Anglicans, the Quakers, and so on, actually forced them all to tolerate each other. No single group was strong enough to dominate the others.
I remember reading a quote of his where he says something like, if there were only one religion in England, there would be danger of tyranny. If there were two, they would cut each other's throats. But there are 30, and they live in peace and happiness.
That's the one. It's a foundational insight of liberalism. He saw that pluralism creates peace. It wasn't that the English people were inherently nicer or more tolerant. It was that the structural balance of power kept anyone from taking over completely. Then he looked at commerce. He went to the London Stock Exchange.
And this is one of his most famous observations, but help us understand the why here. Why does a stock exchange, of all things, create tolerance? It seems like a strange connection to make.
This is the big aha moment, and it's arguably the most important economic and social insight of the century. He goes to the London Stock Exchange. Now, you have to remember, in France, money is considered vulgar. Nobility is about land and blood and titles. You don't talk about trade. A gentleman does not work.
Right. Talking about money at the dinner table is a massive faux pas. It's seen as beneath a person of quality.
Exactly. But in London, Voltaire stands on the floor of the stock exchange, and he watches these guys, a rabbi, a vicar, an imam, a Presbyterian, all screaming at each other over stock prices. They're in the pit, trading shares in the Dutch East India Company. And he realizes something absolutely profound. Greed is a peacemaker.
That sounds completely counterintuitive. Usually we think of greed as the cause of wars and conflict.
But in this specific context, he saw that it cures bigotry. Voltaire writes that when they're on the floor of the exchange, they don't call each other infidels or heretics. They call each other solvent or bankrupt. The religious label completely disappears, and the economic label takes over.
The only sin is going broke.
He realized that if you want people to stop killing each other over which god they pray to, get them to do business together, the market creates a neutral zone.
So commerce becomes this powerful, secularizing force.
He argues that the market is, in a way, more moral than the church, because the market forces you to treat your enemy with a degree of respect if you want his gold. If you hate the Jew or the Muslim you're trading with, you lose the deal. So you swallow your hate and you shake hands.
And that is a direct shot at the French court, which was obsessively focused on religious purity and noble bloodlines at the expense of everything else. And then finally, there's government.
Parliament. He saw a government that, imperfectly, yes, and he saw its flaws, but it served liberty. He saw a system where the king's power was limited by law, where taxes couldn't be raised without the consent of a representative body. He compared it to the tyrannies of ancient Rome and modern France and found them both wanting.
So the English had managed to tame their king without killing him. Well, not this one anyway.
They'd had their civil war a century earlier and sorted it out. They had found a balance. And Voltaire saw this and basically wrote it all down in his letters.
So the expert consensus is that he used England as a mirror.
A funhouse mirror? Maybe. He likely exaggerated how perfect England was to make France look even worse. He was holding up the British model to shame the French. He was saying, look, our neighbors across the channel have religious tolerance, a dynamic economy, and a limited government. Why are we still arresting people for writing poems and breaking old men on wheels?
This brings up a really interesting narrative that I found in our notes. It fits in perfectly here because it illustrates the tension Voltaire himself felt. I heard an old anecdote about a young secretary who was working in the Grand Library at Ferney, which was Voltaire's estate, just a few years before the French Revolution kicked off.
Oh, this is such a telling moment. It really captures the generational gap that was opening up.
Right. So you have to try to imagine this young man. He's surrounded by stacks of Voltaire's correspondence with English lords and French peasants alike. The whole place smells of old paper and ink. And he's watching the elderly philosopher. Voltaire is old now. He's frail. Maybe he's drinking his 40th cup of coffee for the day. And he's obsessively annotating his old journals about his time in London.
Still obsessed with the English model.
Completely. He's still praising the way the English could change their laws without burning their neighbors' houses down. To Voltaire, the British model was like a garden that you prune with care. You cut out the dead branches, you trim the hedges, but you keep the tree alive.
The garden metaphor is very Voltaire. It's the last line of Candide, right? Il faut cultiver notre jardin. We must cultivate our garden.
Exactly. But the young secretary, he looks out the window toward the French border, and figuratively speaking, the air in France is beginning to smell of smoke. He sees a growing, hungry, angry crowd that doesn't want a garden. They don't want to prune the tree.
They want a forest fire.
They want a forest fire. They want to clear the land entirely and start from scratch.
That is a chilling image. And it perfectly captures the tragedy of Voltaire's political position in his later years.
The narrative beat here is that the secretary watches the old man and realizes there's this huge disconnect. Voltaire truly believed that if the king and the nobility would only listen to reason, the fundamental structure of France could be saved through gradual, sensible reform. But the secretary, who represents the next generation, He knew it was way too late for pruning.
And this connects directly to the source material we have from those Reddit discussions comparing the French and American revolutions. It's a crucial distinction that people often miss. The American Revolution, which Voltaire admired from afar, was arguably much closer to that British model of reform.
So,
Well, it was primarily a political change. They swapped the king for a president, they wrote a new constitution, but the underlying social structure, the wealthy landowners, the merchants, the legal traditions inherited from Britain, that remained largely intact.
right, it wasn't a total social reset, but the French model, that was something else entirely.
The French model became total deconstruction. It wasn't just about changing the government. It was about destroying the entire class system, abolishing the church, rewriting the calendar, changing the very way people spoke to each other. It was class warfare. And our sources suggest this is exactly what Voltaire feared most. He feared the mob. He wanted the British model constitutional reform.
But because the French system was so rigid, so brittle, and refused to bend, it eventually just snapped.
Exactly. Voltaire was the off-ramp. He was showing them the path to a less bloody future. And when the French monarchy and aristocracy missed that off-ramp, they headed straight for the cliff of the Reign of Terror. Voltaire wanted a revolution of the mind, but what he got was a revolution of the guillotine.
That's a powerful thought, a revolution of the mind. Which leads us to his return to France. He didn't stay in England forever. He came back, but he didn't go to Paris immediately because it was still too dangerous for him. He went to a place called Syria.
Yes, the CRA period. This is another transformative stage in his life. This is where he connects with Émilie du Châtelet. And we have to stop here and give her proper credit. She is often just footnoted as his mistress, which is a complete crime against history.
The sources mention her as the Newton translator.
She did the definitive French translation of Newton's Principia Mathematica, and it's still used today. She was a brilliant mathematician and physicist. In all likelihood, she was smarter than Voltaire when it came to hard science.
And they lived together in this semi-exile, right? It sounds like a strange arrangement. Her husband was technically around, but he just let them be.
It was a very 18th century aristocratic arrangement. The husband was a military man, often away, and he seems to have accepted the situation. Voltaire rebuilt the chateau with his own money again, his wealth coming in handy, and he and Émilie turned it into a private research lab.
An intellectual incubation.
That's the perfect term for it. They performed physics experiments, trying to replicate Newton's work. They analyzed the Bible line by line, looking for contradictions and historical inaccuracies. They wrote histories. This is where Voltaire really shifts gears. Before this, he was primarily a poet and a satirist. After Syria, he becomes a true fighter. The source material notes a clear shift toward political and social justice.
He starts picking fights that actually matter to the common man, not just the elites. And this leads to another incredible story from our files. I saw a thread online recently that revisited the Calas Affair, but it tried to imagine it from the perspective of a simple merchant sitting in a Parisian coffee house in 1762.
The Calas Affair. This is it. This is the defining moment of Voltaire's crusade against dogma. This is where he stops being just a writer and becomes a European force of nature.
So let's set the scene. Imagine this merchant. He's sitting in a coffee house, which were, the internet cafes of the day. They were hotbeds of gossip and sedition. And he's leaning over a tallow candle to read one of Voltaire's pamphlets. And you have to remember, these pamphlets were illegal. They were contraband. You could get arrested just for being caught with one.
So it's high-stakes reading. He's probably looking over his shoulder.
Exactly. And he's reading about a man named Jean Calas. For those listening who don't know the story, Calas was a Protestant merchant in the city of Toulouse, which was a very staunchly Catholic city, and he was accused of murdering his own son.
The accusation was that he killed his son to prevent him from converting to Catholicism.
And was there any evidence?
Almost certainly not. The historical consensus now is that the son, who was known to be moody and had gambling debts, likely committed suicide. But in the intense religious heat of Toulouse, the Catholic mob and the local judges quickly decided it had to be a ritual religious killing by the Protestant family.
So it was a witch hunt, basically.
A textbook case. And what happened to Jean Calas?
We need to talk about what justice looked like in 1762. When we say Calas was executed, it wasn't a lethal injection or a quick hanging. It was the wheel.
I almost don't want to ask, but for the sake of history.
Yeah.
What exactly is the wheel?
It is a method of execution designed to inflict the maximum amount of pain a human being can endure without dying immediately. They tie the condemned person to a large cartwheel, spread-eagled. Then the executioner, with a heavy iron bar, systematically breaks every major bone in their arms and legs. That's nauseating.
Yeah, it gets worse. After the bones are shattered, they leave the person on the wheel, still alive, to die of exposure and shock, which could take hours, sometimes days, and the crowd. The crowd gathered and cheered.
That's the part that's hard to comprehend.
And this is what woke Voltaire up. He's sitting in his comfortable estate near Geneva, and he hears about this old man, a fellow merchant of modest means, broken on the wheel, screaming his innocence until the very end. And the reason for this medieval barbarism: rumor, hearsay, blind religious bias.
It wasn't just a miscarriage of justice, it was a ritual sacrifice on the altar of fanaticism.
Exactly. And that's why Voltaire went nuclear. He didn't just write a polite letter to the editor. He launched a 3-year, one-man media campaign. He flooded Europe with pamphlets. He hired the best lawyers. He wrote letters to kings and influential aristocrats. He coined the famous phrase, "écraser l'infâme," crush the loathsome thing.
And the loathsome thing wasn't just one bad judge.
No. It was the whole system of religious intolerance. It was that specific kind of organized, confident, murderous stupidity that breaks old men on wheels and calls it justice.
And the merchant in the coffee house reading that illegal pamphlet, that was the moment public opinion started to become a real force in France. Voltaire practically invented the concept of the public intellectual intervening in legal matters.
This is the key insight. Voltaire wasn't just fighting for one man's justice. He was arguing that an entire society should be run by rational rules and evidence and merit, not by the divine right of a few to censor and persecute the many. He proved that the pen could actually stop the sword.
And did he succeed?
He did. After a long fight, the King's Council in Paris overturned the Toulouse verdict. They exonerated Jean Calas posthumously. It was a massive, unprecedented victory for reason over dogma.
The source material connects this directly to the ideas of orthodoxy and thought police.
Yes. And if we look at some of the modern analysis, like those Reddit threads on orthodoxy, we see a very clear modern parallel being drawn, whether it's the Catholic Church in 1762 or what people today call cancel culture. And you see this on both the left and the right. The mechanism is often the same. It's the enforcement of conformity over truth. It's the idea that you must believe this set of things or you are a monster and must be cast out.
And Voltaire's response to that was to attack the dogma itself, not just the people enforcing it.
His argument was fundamentally for meritocracy against dogma. He didn't care what your religion was. He cared if your argument was sound. He didn't care about your bloodline. He cared if you were competent and just.
This is where that famous sentiment comes in, the one everyone knows. I disapprove of what you say, but I will defend to the death your right to say it.
Right. And now, a quick fact check from the sources. Voltaire never actually wrote those exact words. It was a biographer, Evelyn Beatrice Hall, who wrote them later as a summary of his attitude on freedom of speech.
Okay.
But the sentiment is 100% him. It is the absolute core of his philosophy. It's the defense of the rational mind against both a mob and the state.
It feels like we owe our entire modern sense of fair play and free inquiry to this stubborn, difficult Frenchman. But wait, I want to pause on the money part again, because we're painting him as this rebel hero fighting for the little guy, but looking at the notes, this guy was essentially a war profiteer at one point, wasn't he?
Absolutely. We cannot and should not canonize him as a saint. He was ruthless with money. He was an incredibly shrewd and sometimes ethically questionable businessman.
I mean, the sources mention he made a fortune by figuring out a loophole in the Parisian lottery and basically rigging it. And he invested heavily in army supplies. It feels a bit rich, pun intended, for him to be lecturing the world on morality when he's funding his philosophy with some pretty shady deals.
That is the great Voltaire contradiction. And I think that actually makes him more interesting, not less. He wasn't some starving artist living in a garret, begging for patronage. He believed that to be intellectually independent, you had to be financially independent. You had to be filthy rich.
He said that.
He explicitly said, I want to be wealthy so I don't have to listen to anyone. It was a conscious strategy.
So it was F you money before that was even a term.
100%. He bought his freedom of speech. He knew that if he was poor, the system would crush him without a second thought. But if he was rich, he could be a player. He could afford the best lawyers. He could print his own pamphlets. He could live wherever he wanted.
That complicates the picture. He wasn't a Democrat in the modern sense then.
He had a deep suspicion of the uneducated mob. He believed in an elite of the mind. He thought the smart, rational people should be the ones running things, people like him, basically. He defended the merchant's right to justice, but he didn't necessarily want that merchant running the government.
Which explains his next move. He tried to work with kings. He thought he could influence them from the inside.
Right. This was the era of the so-called enlightened despots. The idea was that a monarch, if he was philosophical and rational, could bring about reform from the top down without all the messiness of revolution.
And he finds the perfect candidate, Frederick the Great of Prussia. Frederick is known as the philosopher king. It sounds like a match made in heaven. Two geniuses, one running a country, one writing the books that could guide him.
And it ended in a complete train wreck. It was a disaster.
What happened?
The reality check was brutal. Frederick wanted a court jester, a celebrity intellectual who could polish his bad French poetry and make his court look sophisticated. He did not want a mentor or a critic. And Voltaire couldn't keep his mouth shut.
Of course not.
He got involved in shady financial deals in Berlin, which embarrassed the king. He mocked the head of the Prussian Academy of Sciences. He basically treated the Prussian court like his personal playground, and Frederick got tired of it very quickly.
So it was an ego clash of the titans.
Exactly. Voltaire sees that enlightened monarchy is often a sham. The king loves philosophy right up until the point where the philosophy questions the king's absolute power. Then suddenly, philosophy is treason.
So he leaves in disgust and actually gets arrested on his way out by Frederick's agents, which is a whole other drama involving stolen poetry manuscripts. And he realizes he can't live in France because it's too dangerous, and he can't live in Prussia because he's burned that bridge. He has nowhere to go.
This is the final stage of his exile, the institutional exile. He can't work within any existing system. He realizes he needs his own kingdom.
And this leads us to Ferney. You have to try to imagine the layout of the estate at Ferney. It's right on the border between France and the independent Republic of Geneva. I was watching a documentary on this, and it struck me how Voltaire lived his life literally on the edge.
Geographically and metaphorically, it was a move of pure strategic genius.
The visual is amazing. He buys this estate specifically because if the French king sends soldiers to arrest him, he can hop in a carriage and be in the territory of Geneva in under an hour. But if the Swiss authorities in Geneva, who were very strict Calvinists and hated his plays and his lifestyle, got angry with him, he could hop back across the border into France.
He played the jurisdictions against each other. It's brilliant. He was functionally unarrestable.
But inside his estate at Ferney, he didn't just hide and write, he built something. He started a watchmaking factory. He started a silk farm. He drained the local swamps to improve agriculture. He built a church, mostly to annoy the local bishop by putting his own name on the front of it larger than God's.
Laughs. A classic Voltaire move.
He created a prosperous, thriving community from scratch.
And this connects deeply to our source on conservatism and community, which is a fascinating angle. Voltaire is usually seen as this radical, liberal progressive, but at Ferney, he was acting like a traditional community builder. He was creating what sociologists call a mediating structure.
What does that mean in plain English? Mediating structure.
It means he built a buffer zone. A mediating structure is something that stands between the lonely, vulnerable individual and the massive, overwhelming power of the state. It could be a church, a guild, a local community, a corporation. Voltaire proved that an intellectual exile isn't just a hermit living in a cave. He proved you can build a functional micro-society based on reason, free enterprise, and trade. He protected his people from the French tax collectors on one side and the Genevan religious police on the other.
He basically built his own little kingdom where reason was the monarch. He was the benevolent dictator of Ferney.
Exactly. And referencing Edward Said's source material, again, this is The Unhoused Mind, made manifest. Sedlin argues that the intellectual exile is uncomfortable, nomadic, and decentered, but this very distance, this alienation, allows them to see the truth more clearly. Voltaire at Ferney is the ultimate example of this productive alienation. He wasn't comfortable anywhere, so he made his own comfort. He wasn't at home in any nation, so he built a home for his ideas.
And he was incredibly productive there. He wrote his masterpiece, Candide, there. He wrote thousands of letters, conducted his legal campaigns like the Calas case. He became known as the innkeeper of Europe.
Everyone who was anyone, intellectuals, artists, aristocrats, even future American founders, made a pilgrimage to Ferney to pay homage. James Boswell, Casanova, they all stopped there.
He became a power in his own right, without an army, without a crown, just with a pen and a strategic location on the border. He showed that a single, determined individual could stand on equal footing with a state.
He was a one-man institution.
Which brings us full circle to the end of his life, the triumphant return. It's 1778. He's 83 years old. He's been in exile for decades. And he decides to go back to Paris one last time to see his final play performed.
This is the scene we started with. The carriage, the customs officers, the contraband line.
He enters Paris, and it's absolute bedlam. The sources describe it as something we would recognize today. He is mobbed like a rock star. The French Academy, the theater, the people in the streets, they are touching his clothes, they're throwing flowers, they literally crown him with a laurel wreath in the theater box. It's Beatlemania for an octogenarian philosopher.
It's the King of Voltaire entering the city of the King of France. And it was seen as a direct challenge to the monarchy just by his very presence. The actual king, Louis XVI now, refused to see him, of course, but he couldn't arrest him. Voltaire was simply too popular.
But there's a shadow over this triumph, isn't there? A dark irony.
There is. And this is where we have to synthesize the whole deep dive. Voltaire represents the critical spirit. He spent his entire life destroying the legitimacy of the old regime. He made the kings and the bishops look ridiculous, corrupt, and incompetent. He stripped them of their divine aura.
He pulled back the curtain and showed everyone that the great and powerful Oz was just a little man behind a machine.
But, and here's the double-edged sword, by destroying the legitimacy of the old system, he helped fuel the revolution that was coming just 11 years after his death. The French Revolution.
The fire.
The forest fire he feared.
Yeah.
The fire that the young secretary saw coming from the window at Ferney's.
He wanted the English garden. He wanted careful, rational reform. But his work was so effective at deconstructing the old ways that when the structure finally collapsed, it didn't just bend, it shattered. The source material regarding the French Revolution is very clear on this. It didn't just change the government. It killed the nobility, seized church lands, and tore the very fabric of society apart.
So in a way, Voltaire lit the match, but he would have been horrified by the explosion. I think that's a very fair assessment. If Voltaire had lived to see the Reign of Terror in 1793, he almost certainly would have been guillotined himself. He was too moderate, too elite, too wealthy. He would have been seen as an enemy of the people. The lesson here, and the sources are clear on this, is that the danger wasn't necessarily Voltaire's ideas themselves. The danger was a rigid, brittle system, the French monarchy, that refused to bend. England bent. It reformed. France didn't. Voltaire warned them. He said, "Look at England, change or you will break." They didn't listen until it was time for the guillotine.
That is a very heavy lesson. The system that refuses to allow contraband ideas to be debated eventually gets overrun by them in the most violent way possible. So let's bring this home. What does this all mean for us? We aren't living in 18th century France, but we are living in a time of intense polarization, what people call cancel culture, and huge questions about who gets to speak and what ideas are considered dangerous.
I think the archetype of the intellectual exile is more relevant than ever. In the digital age, we often think of freedom as belonging to a tribe. You know, I'm on this team, so I'm free to speak within my team's accepted rules.
Right, you find your echo chamber and you stay there.
But Voltaire's life suggests that true intellectual freedom, real critical thought, only comes when you are willing to stand on the border.
Uncomfortable, unhoused, willing to be punched by a chevalier and ignored by the king.
And potentially labeled as contraband by all sides. It means building your own garden, your own ferny, while the giants fight around you. The final provocative thought from all this material might be this. Perhaps the most productive and intellectually honest place to be isn't at the center of culture, shouting the loudest for your team. Perhaps it's on the edge, observing, critiquing, and working to keep the lights of reason on when the rest of the world seems determined to burn things down.